Welcome to one of my favorite pieces of road in all of Formula One. Relatively innocuous part of Bahrain out there in the sand dunes, turns 9 and 10. And what makes this piece of road so great is the build-up, the importance of the center section, and then what follows afterwards. And the key to this whole complex, of course, is a great exit from turn 10. There's a long straight after this, so any small mistake into 10 is completely penalized with an acceleration run, which is actually running parallel to the main straight, just adjacent to the F2 and F3 pits. But it is a long straight, and therefore it rewards a driver who does things well, and it definitely has a big penalty for those who don't. Well, that's the penalty. Now let's just talk about the approach to this all-important, very tight left-hander. There are a few corners in Bahrain which are tight, preceded by a long straight, and therefore a premium is placed on accuracy from high-speed braking. That's not the case here, although obviously accuracy in braking is critical. This corner is preceded, if you please, by a very, very fast left-hand kink. And it's not your standard left-hand kink either. The topography changes dramatically around this corner. The drivers approach it relatively blind, and then the road falls away from them just as they're hitting the apex. Now here you can see the general apex that most drivers use through the kink. It's not flush to the curb because most drivers realize that you've got to have a nice open flat area where you've got to be braking for 10, and the last thing you need is for the car to be angled as you're hitting the brakes, and you're hitting the brakes very hard from 7th gear down to 1st or 2nd gear. And that's why you see so many drivers locking inside fronts going into 10. The car's carrying lateral G-load from the left-hand kink, and they're trying to get the car set up for the left-hander. And indeed, there's also very, very hard braking. Now in this image, you can see approximately where most drivers are applying the brakes really hard from 7th gear down to 1st or 2nd gear for the tight left-hander. That's Sebastian Vettel in the Ferrari. And you can see how much G-loading there is on the car because they're coming out of this kink, it's carrying a lot of G, and then they're having to get the car turned and straightened, kind of, into 10. For most drivers, the car's never straight. That's why you see so many lockups of the inside front, and that's why you see so many drivers running wide out of here or having an issue. Now sometimes lockup of the inside front isn't that significant, particularly if the car's still pointed relatively straight. You can get around the problem, you can get the car tucked in, and you can still get a nice clean exit out of 10. Other times it is a problem, particularly if the car has quite a lot of angle on it. So yes, if we take I don't know, a 20,000 foot view of the approach to turn 10, you could say that most drivers do a pretty good job of getting through that kink as quickly as possible, and it's flat, and then getting the car stopped. There will be issues as the tires go off, as the fuel load changes, as the grip level changes, as the temperature, the ambient temperature changes. And don't forget, Bahrain 1 is a race that will be starting at dusk. But what makes this a great series of corners is that there is a solution to getting it absolutely right. Now that normally doesn't apply to most bits of road in Formula One. The entry to Maggots, the Beckett section at Silverstone is the entry. The entry to Copse is the entry. You can have a gentle, firm input into the steering. You can have a seamless transition, Lewis Hamilton, Jarno Trulli-like. At the same time, there's not much you can do in terms of using the road. What is so great about turns 9, 10 is that there is a piece of road you can use here that solves many of the problems. So let's reiterate, here's the standard apex for that left-hand kink. And don't forget, at this point, all the drivers are wary and thinking of, wow, we've got turn 10 coming up, I've got to get a clean exit, got to get a clean exit. And if you extrapolate that train of thought and you say the bigger, the wider, the better grip area you have in which to stop the car, the more chance you're going to have a great exit from turn 10. The first time Lewis Hamilton raced in Bahrain was 2007 when he was in Formula One. GP2 didn't go to Bahrain in 2006, his GP2 championship winning season. And so in 2007, I made a point of going down to the outside of the 9-10 area to watch Lewis's first few laps in the McLaren around this section. And what amazed me was how far in the middle of the road he immediately placed the car through the left-hand kink, turn 9. He was probably a good half a car's length to the center of the road compared with Fernando Alonso. And of course that was putting a lot of debris on the outside of the circuit. He was going through the marbles every lap. But I continued to watch, and in the second session, of course, the track started to pick up a bit of grip, and there was Lewis still using this center section of road on the approach to 10. Now they were getting to be almost flat through the kink, and it was really impressive to watch because he was there on the edge of the marbles in the center of the road, but then getting a pretty good entry into 10 and not making many mistakes on the exit from 10. Now think about that. We're talking, what, 7th gear, really, really quick. And here's Lewis putting the car in the middle of the road, right on the edge of the marbles, the little rubber worms and the debris that's inevitably always in the middle of the track off the racing line. He's right on the edge of that, but he's doing that because he wants a much wider approach into 10. Now that requires a lot of commitment, a lot of skill, a lot of balance, and dare I say, some bravery. And here's another thing. It doesn't matter if he actually has to lift slightly on that wider line to get away with it, because what follows immediately afterwards is a very hard braking area. So if he's feathering the throttle slightly because he is on the marbles, he's not losing any time at all. It's not as if there's a long straight following and he's suddenly dropped 400 or 500 revs. And then lap after lap, race after race, Lewis Hamilton found himself with a much better area in which to get the car stopped. Rob Wilson calls that area the flat car area. In other words, you've got all 4 tyres flat on the road when you're applying the brakes. The car's going to stop much more efficiently, and therefore you're going to be able to brake later. Now, of course, all the drivers trail brake into turn 10. They're braking as they're steering. That's because there's a very compressed braking area, and that's because it's the sort of corner where you can get away with that. But you can see that the G load through the car is effectively adding up exponentially. They've got load in the car, now they've got angle in the car, they hit the brakes really hard, and the car's skewed. Here's an image of our friend Romain Grosjean having a lot of fun through this 9-10 section, using all of his reflexes and balance to kind of get away with it. And there are several drivers who kind of operate that way. Now they get away with it kind of because of their skill, because of their reflexes, their balance, all the things we've been talking about when it's a reflexy, reactive driver. Carlos Sainz is a similar sort of driver. Now, by contrast, here's a shot of Valtteri Bottas in the Mercedes at last year's race. Now, you can see he too is locking up the inside front, but he's nothing like as skewed at this point of the track as Grosjean. He's done a pretty good job of getting a slightly wider apex and getting the car stopped, but he's still got quite a lot of angle in the car as he's braking hard into 10. That's why the inside front wheel is locking. So let's now compare Lewis Hamilton at exactly the same position. What's important here is to look at the position of the car relative to the curb, and this is taken at just about the same place, as you can see. Now Lewis, if you look at this part of the bodywork here, you can see where it is relative to the curb. Look where Valtteri is relative to the curb. In other words, he's come down here from nothing like as wide an approach as Lewis, and because of that he's got to get more steering angle into the car sooner. He's got more load in the car, and therefore he's locking up the inside front. Lewis has come down from his wider area approximately here and given himself a much bigger area in which to get the car stopped. So he's got nothing like the same reason to have to load up the car so early. He can load it up at his own rate when he wants to, when the car is right. Of course, every lap is slightly different, so you can never say this is exactly how Lewis does it. And this isn't necessarily about racing line. What this is about, as I've been saying in many videos prior to this, is about managing the dynamic weight of the car and when to apply the brakes really, really hard, having initially warned the brakes of what you're going to be doing. And the problem is, for most drivers, this locking up of the inside front, which then definitely compromises the way they get into 10, when they can get on the power and how they can feed on the power out of 10. It requires patience too, this, because that area there, you might think, wow, I've got the car stopped, it's no problem, I'll get in. But Lewis is so good at being patient with the brakes, patient with the throttle. I think that's one of the areas he's really improved in the last 2 to 3 years. He's got a sort of Sergio Perez, Jenson Button, Kimi Raikkonen-like feel now for the way he puts the power down and how patient he is before he starts applying the power in the car. You very rarely see Lewis with the back end more than 10 degrees out of line when he's got grip. Obviously in low grip conditions it's a completely different story. Then it's all about finding the grip, and we saw in the last race how good he was at taking the wide line away from the racing line and just getting the car pointed straight as soon as possible.